So today we'll be talking about Chapter 13, Section 2, talking about settling on the Great Plains. What was life like for these individuals who moved out to the Great Plains? What were some hardships they experienced? And how did the land change as a result of these rapid population growths? So as we talk about settlement, one of the biggest changes that I forgot to mention was the railroads. The major technological improvement that is going to improve folks' ability to get out to these places. I mean, yes, settlers were moving as far as Oregon long before the railroad, but these journeys were perilous. People died along the way. I'm sure you've heard of the Donner Party. Many people didn't make it. And many more were discouraged from even trying. Many more were discouraged from even trying to make the journey because it was so perilous, it was so difficult. But railroads are going to make this possible. It's going to make it easy. You buy a ticket, in a few days, you are safely and comfortably in a new place. And in the 1860s, the major infrastructure project going on in our country was the building of railroads, in particular transcontinental railroads. By the 1880s, there were 5 of these, 5 railroad tracks stretching across the entire country, connecting the east and the west coast. This is going to attract people to be able to move. For the first time, you can buy a ticket and you can ride a train anywhere you want to go in the country. That is generally. I mean, you still have to migrate somewhat, but towns and cities are going to grow along these railroads. Railroads are now the new real estate developers selling land to farmers, and are going to attract many people to come into the area because, number one, transportation requires a large labor force. And so immigrants are going to come in, particularly from China, but from all over the world to work on these things. Now also in 1862, a law was passed, a very important law called the Homestead Act. Any person may receive 160 free acres of land. Any person who so desire may receive 160 acres of free land. There were a few qualifications. You had to be the head of a household, generally a male, and you had to be willing to live on this land. You didn't just to get a piece of paper saying you have land in Nebraska. No, you have to go move to Nebraska to receive this land. But during the heyday of the Homestead Act, up through about 1900, 600,000 families took advantage of this opportunity, receiving free land, and this helped to develop the West. Many of these people were exodusters. That is, African Americans leaving the Southeast for a number of reasons and moved to places like Kansas or Nebraska or various other territories that were rapidly growing in population. Now, there was a share of corruption. I mean, railroads were profiting from this, taking advantage of these people. Plenty of folks were speculating, that is, hiring someone to go and live on this land, to wait it out until that land became more valuable. In reality, of the Great Plains, where the Homestead Act applied, only about 10% of this land actually went to families. The rest was gobbled up by speculators who profited from this, or from railroads who were selling this, again, for a profit. But the bottom line is around 600,000 people qualified and were able to start new lives thanks to the Homestead Act. By 1872, everywhere in the lower 48 had been seen by someone. There were no more frontiers. There was no more unexplored territory. Yellowstone National Park was the first of its kind, the first national park created to protect wilderness areas. But yet by 1890, again, all lands had been explored by someone. But yet the frontier has remained an important part of American culture. We are a people of explorers. We are a people of adventurers. So, you've hit the jackpot. You and your family have qualified for the Homestead Act, and you have now received your 160 acres of free land on the Kansas prairies. Congratulations. You really got to go out there and see it sometime. And aside from the handful of towns that you pass through and the couple of large cities, it's pretty empty. It's pretty flat. And you often go hours, or if you were walking or riding a horse, days without seeing so much as a tree. So congratulations, your piece of land has no trees. There's a railroad, but if you want to buy lumber, you're talking about a very expensive price tag on that lumber. You're probably not going to be able to afford it. So a lot of first-generation homesteaders would build their homes from what they had on the land. And the most abundant building material on the land was sod. No one had lived or developed permanent dwellings in much of the Kansas territory ever. And so eons of grass rotting on top of grass rotting had developed a very thick sod, a layer that can be cut into bricks, and you can build things out of it. And that's exactly what they did. And so many people wound up living in sod homes until they could afford to buy the lumber they needed for their homes. Many of these homesteaders were virtually alone. I mean, this is like Little House on the Prairie lifestyle, where people are living in very traditional roles. Families were having to work together to survive, men and women cooperating together. In fact, Western states often tend to be more progressive than do Eastern states because they have developed this culture of cooperation out of necessity. In fact, it was the Western states that, for example, first allowed women to vote. It was the Western states where many men and women were working equally side by side. But communities did develop as towns grew. But this part of our country is still a very wide open and empty part of our country because it is sparsely populated. But as we talked about in the bell ringer, new technologies allowed for mass production of agricultural goods. And this is actually going to help farming become more viable. Farming has come a long way throughout our history. There's a science to it. You can major in it. You can study it at this very school. You can take agricultural classes and learn the science of managing domesticated animals or the science of cultivating crops for profit. And there's even a business side as well. There's a lot to farming. The Morrill Act, first passed in 1862 and strengthened in 1890, provided finances for agricultural schools to develop. And while, yes, you can learn the science of farming in a classroom, there's also a practical side. And so in 1887, the Hatch Act created agricultural experiment stations. For example, learning farms, where you can go and practice farming, and you can work, and you can get an internship, and you can learn everything there is to know, because a lot of the skills required to be a successful farmer are learned at the farm. But these mechanical reapers, these steel plows, the timber to build these farm homes, come at a great cost. And while if you drive through Kansas or the eastern parts of Colorado or even the Missouri territories, you'll see huge farms, an entire day's worth of driving and seeing nothing but farms and maybe a city or two. It's incredible. Many of these farms are the size of counties. Huge operations, multi-million-dollar businesses. These are called bonanza farms, often dedicated to the growth of a single crop. These often employ large labor forces, and they operate and function just like a corporation. Some of these single crop operations went completely bankrupt throughout the 1890s because of economic problems. For example, when shipment costs increased, farmers often wound up in debt. Farming can diversify. It can be a successful and predictable business, but it does often function and rely on many factors to be successful. And one of those is transportation cost. When the price of gas goes up, the price of groceries goes up. The two go hand in hand because farmers rely on transportation to get their goods to market.